Testing. Now you can hear me. I think if I use the built-in mic, for some reason it didn't want to let me use the lapel mic. I've switched microphones and I'm pretty sure you can hear me now. I don't know how good the volume is, but I also have, well, let's see. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, that's what I wanted to know. So I'll just, I'll just use that microphone. And I'll turn this one off. I don't know why it wasn't working. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the latest live stream from the New Thinking Aloud channel. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. It's a pleasure to be here once again. I'm going to be talking today and answering questions specifically about human postmortem survival. And naturally, we've encouraged each of you to read the essay, which is available to you online. If you haven't seen it yet, you can go to the Bigelow Institute and you can find that on Google. And you'll find the winning essays there on their website. Of course, it'll be a little late for you to read the essay and still pose a question if you haven't already read it, but that's an option, I guess. Maybe I should say a few introductory words about it before I take questions from the viewers. And I see the first question has been posed by my beloved wife, Dr. Janelle Barlow. And she's curious. She says, how has writing this essay affected your own thinking about postmortem survival? Did anything surprise you in the process of gathering this information? And of course, I've been predisposed toward postmortem survival from the beginning because of the personal experience I had. I can look back 50 years and see how it changed my life. So well, let me put it this way. If you've had an experience and you can say 50 years ago, it made a major change in the direction of your life, and then you notice in the biographies of other individuals ranging from Bishop James Pike, the Episcopalian Bishop of California, or Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century, according to Time magazine, that in each case, their lives were dramatically and permanently changed as the result of what we call an after-death communication. That gives you a very solid understanding that something is really going on. The question is, what? What is it? Are we primates with our little brains here? Are we capable of understanding what's actually going on? Well, I can tell you in the parapsychology community, there's still a very vibrant and healthy debate as to how we interpret the evidence. Is it the question of telepathy and clairvoyance? Is that the explanation, that if you have a living brain, then you can be psychic? Or is it, as William James thought, a question of the cosmic reservoir? After we die, it's all one, all knowledge. Everything that ever happened is part of the one mind that sees through the eyes of every living creature. Or is it, as the spiritualists would maintain, that unique personalities survive and maintain their own distinct integrity, even in the afterlife? And of course, from a scientific point of view, it's very hard to sort out these hypotheses. It's almost impossible even to develop experimental tests that could distinguish amongst them. So one of the safest things to say is that something paranormal is going on. But Janelle is asking me what surprised me. And I have to say this, as I dug into it more deeply, the major surprise that I got was in the field of instrumental transcommunication, or ITC, sometimes also called electronic voice phenomena, or EVP. I had sort of tended, like most people, I think, in parapsychology, to say, the examples that I have heard of were not very strong. It seemed to me like this is an area ripe for what we call pareidoia, or psychological projection of patterns that are created in our individual psyches and projected onto a random pattern, much the way the ancient peoples saw the mythological stories projected into the patterns of stars in the sky. But when I began interviewing Dr. Annabella Cardoso, who has been on this channel several times, and when I talked to my friend Dan Drazen, who made several documentaries showing that some of the communications are very detailed and very distinct. They're not at all fuzzy and vague. I had to take into account that something real is almost certainly going on here. And of course, I had an experience of my own of, I think of it as ITC. I've talked about it many times, having to do with the late Elizabeth Targ, who was a friend of mine, the daughter of the great parapsychologist and physicist Russell Targ, who's been on this channel many times and will be on it again. Elizabeth died at the age of 41, over 15 years ago, maybe close to 18 years ago now. And there were many communications coming from her around the time of her death. On one occasion, I had a lucid dream. Elizabeth appeared to me in the dream, and I said to her, "Oh, Elizabeth, I'm so glad to see you. I am so impressed with all of the communications that I'm hearing about from you, especially," I said, "the physical ones in my dream." At that very moment, I was awakened because the phone next to my bed rang. And when I picked up that phone, just white noise. Now, the interesting thing about the white noise is that for those of you who listen carefully to all the interviews, there is one we did not long ago with Elizabeth Crone, another Elizabeth. She was a near-death experiencer. This is the lady who was struck by lightning and written about, well, co-authored a book with Professor Jeffrey Kripal called Changed in a Flash about her experience. And part of what she experienced afterwards is that her deceased grandfather, whom she met during her out-of-body experience after she was struck by lightning, one evening called her on the phone from the afterlife. She had a long talk with him, and her husband was asleep in bed next to her. He kept asking her, well, he was half awake. He said, who's this? Who are you talking to on the phone? As she's having this conversation, she kept sort of shushing him up. And then afterwards, I asked her, well, if he had been given the phone, what would he have heard? Would he have heard your grandfather's voice? And she said, no, he probably would have just heard white noise, that one needed a certain degree of clairaudience or inner spiritual attunement in order to actually hear the voice. Not everyone would hear it. And that's an interesting phenomenon where it seems as if in the case of apparitions, sometimes an apparition will appear to a group of people. Several people in the group will actually see the apparition, but not everybody. So it does suggest that when it comes to afterlife communication, there's a will to communicate from the other side, but there needs to also be a certain openness or receptivity on our side in order to facilitate the communication two ways. So that leaves, if I were more skeptical, I would have all kinds of doubts that could be raised because of that in terms of what's really going on here. Anyhow, let me now begin to take your questions. And the first one I see here is from Elizabeth Lord, who is also one of our volunteers. Elizabeth says, if you were to teach what you know about how to interpret messages from discarnates, what would you tell your student? What a tough question. If I was to teach about how to interpret messages, you see, if it was about interpreting dream messages from one's own subconscious, I could tell you a lot about that. There's a whole language of dreams, and there are people who suggest, there's actually quite a bit of lore that suggests that discarnates communicate with us in much the same way, using the language of dreams. On the other hand, an awful lot of the communication from discarnates, including my own very intense experience with my great uncle Harry that occurred in 1972, 50 years ago, almost to the date, and changed my life dramatically because it was the catalyst, the main catalyst that caused me to shift from a career path in criminology, studying the negative forms of human deviance, to parapsychology, studying the positive forms of human deviance. But that communication was very direct. It didn't need interpretation. It was just like me talking to you right now. You really don't have to do much in the way of interpreting my words, because I hope I'm speaking in a very straightforward manner. And so when it comes to discarnate communications, you've got a range from the dreamlike imagery and the symbolic interpretations that occur to the direct, straightforward ones. And of course, if I were to teach that, if I had students, my main goal would not be to teach you how to interpret messages from the afterlife or from discarnates. My main goal is to teach you how to open up to the powers inherent within you. How to be the best version of yourself ultimately is the goal of the things that I like to teach. That's ultimately why we're doing the New Thinking Aloud channel. It's wonderful if you should happen to have discarnate communication. It's wonderful if you might happen to be skilled at forecasting the stock market using precognition. But ultimately, bottom line, it's about self-awareness. It's about being the best version of yourself, which I think ultimately also involves opening up to inner wisdom and compassion. So those are the primary aims. Shashi Kant asks, how to know about my previous life? I imagine that we're all curious, and it's an interesting thing. What can I say about previous lives? First of all, we don't know for sure that everybody has had previous lives. I know R.J. Spina, who's been a frequent guest on this program and is a highly intuitive individual. He's the man who cured himself after having been diagnosed with permanent paraplegia or paralysis from the chest on down. He maintains that we all have about, before we become fully enlightened, it takes roughly 35,000 lifetimes. So, by his reckoning, we would all have a lot of them. But in terms of the empirical database, I can tell you at the University of Virginia, they have a database of some 2,500 cases of young children almost as soon as they can begin to talk, describing their past lives. And of those, some 1,700 cases are what we consider solved. So that is far from demonstrating that we all have had past lives. It basically is, if you're willing to interpret it at face value, it suggests that we know about 1,700 individuals who have. But whether everybody chooses that path or not, I think is an open question. I think it's quite possible that we might not. I like to keep it very open-ended. But here's another thing we know from the past life research, and that is the preponderance of people who do remember their past lives remember having died violently in a previous lifetime. And so that raises the question, do you really want to know about your past lives? It might be a gift that you don't know. Now, surely I think we're all influenced if we've had past lives. We have our likes and our dislikes, our phobias, our preferences, our talents, all sorts of things about us are probably conditioned by past life experiences, assuming that they're far more prevalent simply than the research database. But the truth is, most people don't remember. Now, if you really want to dig into it and you're an adult, so that it's not a question of you beginning to talk about a past life as soon as you can begin to speak. The normal way to go about it would be through hypnotic regression therapy. But that can be clouded by the suggestions that come to you from the hypnotherapist. And in fact, even telepathic suggestions from the hypnotherapist. It's a very intimate situation. So in general, here's what I could recommend. Now that I think about it, the Edgar Cayce Foundation, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, did have many years ago a workbook for people to try to figure out their past lives. And they would ask you all kinds of questions like about your dream life. Have you had recurring dreams of a past life? Do you feel a particular preference? Are you drawn towards certain cultures? Do you feel, have you ever visited a foreign location and felt like you've been there before? So there are things like that that can help you to figure it out. But to be honest, I think a certain amount of skepticism is very healthy in this domain. People have said to me, mediums, in fact, spirit mediums and channelers have said to me, you were such and such a famous person in a past lifetime. You were the great ancient philosopher Seneca, or you were William James, who's one of my intellectual heroes in a past life. And I am very intrigued by that, but I also am skeptical. I'm me, as far as I know. I don't have, if I've ever had any memories of having been these people, they lasted a tiny fraction of a second. And so in spite of the fact that I'm here before you now as a champion of the paranormal, I have to say that keeping a healthy skepticism is a good thing. Mr. Black says, Dr. Jeff, could we see any big breakthroughs in afterlife research in the upcoming years? What area looks most promising to you? What a great question. Thank you for that, Mr. Black. I hint at this, probably more than hint at this in the Bigelow essay. And I think that we could build upon several features to develop really what would amount to a new science of the paranormal, building upon, for example, Dr. Charlie Tartt's work on state-specific sciences. Charlie was one of my professors when I was a graduate student in parapsychology at Berkeley. And in 1972, he published a paper in Science magazine saying we could use altered states of consciousness as special research tools. They are like a telescope into another world. You could say that the vast continent of the mind. It's like in the 15th century, explorers were reaching out to the new world and beginning to map whole new continents, and using such techniques as hypnotic regression, mediumship, lucid dreaming, advanced meditation, and the like. People can venture into the depths of the mind, what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, and begin to actually map it out. Now, I think they may find certain regularities going in there, not the kind of regularities that we find here in the physical world, but regularities of a different sort. For example, I wonder how many viewers have had this experience. I think it's relatively common. You're in a dream, you're being chased in the dream. And I do think there's a big overlap between the realm of dreams and the realm of the afterlife. You're being chased, but you're running, but you can't run anymore because it's as if you're caught in quicksand. You can try to run, but you're going nowhere. And it's at that moment when, if you become just a little bit more attentive, a little bit more aware with a slight shift in consciousness, you become lucid enough so that you realize where you are and you say, oh, okay, I can fly now. And that's when you can start to fly in your dream. It's been reported in the literature. I've experienced it on multiple occasions. Other people I know have experienced it. So that's an example of a regularity. It's an example of what might be a boundary between different areas of, you could say, the collective unconscious. You could say it's hyperspace. You could say it's the Bardo planes. We have various words for it, but what's interesting to me is that mathematicians, when it comes to the topology and the geometry of hyperspace, dimensions of space beyond the 3 dimensions of physical space, up, down, right, left, back, forth, that we move in this world, there could be other dimensions, because after all, if the afterlife is real, and I propose that it is, if dreams are real, and they certainly are real in a sense, then they occur somewhere. And that where could very well be hyperspace. And we have extensive mathematical knowledge of, the topology. What happens when you go from 4th dimension to the 5th dimension to the 6th to the 7th to the 8th dimension? There are various transformations geometrically that take place that are well understood in mathematics. Physicists are beginning to explore them in terms of such things as membrane theory and string theory. And I propose that this hyperspace is also the realm of consciousness itself. I've done many interviews with my dear friend Saul Paul Sirag about this. In fact, in the 1993 edition of my classic encyclopedic book, The Roots of Consciousness, there's an appendix by Saul Paul talking about the relationship between consciousness and hyperspace. It's a very sophisticated mathematical appendix. And if we have psychonauts venturing into the Bardo planes, mapping it out, coming up with regularities, and we find that these regularities are isomorphic, which means they map right onto the mathematics of hyperspace, I propose that that would be the basis for an entirely new science of the afterlife. That's how we can move beyond this sort of stalemate that parapsychologists sometimes find themselves in, like, oh, is all this afterlife evidence simply extrasensory perception, clairvoyance, and precognition by the living? Or is it, as William James once suggested, there's a cosmic reservoir that contains all knowledge, and there's spirit beings in there, not necessarily discarnate spirits, but you could say devas, deities, archons, who knows, diamonds in there, and they have access to all this information, and so they masquerade as our deceased loved ones. William James felt that was a hypothesis deserving serious investigation, and he imagined over 100 years ago that sometime in the next century we'd figure that one out. But I can tell you, as of today, we haven't come close. But I can also tell you that if we were to start sending hundreds of psychonauts into the realms of the unconscious, and it's very tricky business, I have no doubt about that. Charles Tart, in his classic 1972 essay, spells out all of the risks. For example, acculturation. How do we avoid the problem of our existing cultural belief systems when we probe the depths of our own psyches? Still, I don't think it's an insurmountable problem any more than the problem of cultural expectations has clouded our understanding of indigenous peoples all over the world, for example. It's a problem, but it's not a problem that we can't begin to address. Okay, let's move on. Christopher Garfius asks, what is your conclusion that happens to individuals when we die? The best answer, I think, comes from the research of near-death experiencers, people who are often pronounced dead, such as the hundreds of people who have been studied who have had cardiac arrests inside of hospitals where they can be monitored medically. Their brain activity shuts down, but they can be revised, or revived, I should say. And roughly 20% of them report a near-death experience after having been revived. I think of that report as being the early stages of the afterlife experience. And typically they report, going through a tunnel, seeing the light at the other end of the tunnel, finding loved ones there and other spiritual beings there to welcome them, to guide them, having a feeling of overwhelming love and bliss, not just coming from this realm, but you're part of it. Now, I have done quite a few interviews with Eben Alexander, the author of Maps of Heaven and Proof of Heaven, describing this experience that he had when he was in a coma for 7 days in great detail. And you can listen to it here on the New Thinking Aloud channel. I think that's our best indication of what you can expect when you first enter the afterlife. Now, a tiny percentage of those people, maybe 1% or so, have negative experiences. And I am under the impression from my conversations with researchers that the negative experiences are often due to cultural expectations. If you believe strongly or at a subconscious level even that you've been a bad person, you've done bad things, and then you're there in the afterlife, well, you may have an experience that fits your expectations. To a large degree, when people come back from a near-death experience, their reports are culturally conditioned. If they're Christian, they may report that they met Jesus. If they're Hindu, they may report they met Yama, the Lord of Death. So there's a certain amount of acculturation that takes place there that I think we can learn to sort through that ultimately, whatever name you put on this is a being that expresses enormous light and love and compassion. Selena Z. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Selena. Is there a parapsychology term for synchronicity shock, when all the answers just come in beautiful connection to the universe that you cry at the perfection? Or is that just bliss or peace? It's a very interesting question. Selena, somebody should give you the credit because I like that term. And as far as I know, you're the one who coined it, synchronicity shock. When the synchronicities are just so overwhelming now. And of course, it can be sometimes negative for people, but also often very positive. But I don't think that in my extensive knowledge of the parapsychological literature, I'm not aware of a better term. DIY craft. It sounds like do-it-yourself craft. Which do you think Bob Bigelow was most impressed with regarding your different, quote, proofs of the afterlife overall? Well, the first thing I should say about that is that Bob Bigelow was not one of the judges, and he made a point of staying out of the judging process, not attempting to influence the judges in any way. So the judges, and I'm told that the judges unanimously selected my essay as the first prize winner in the contest. There were 6 different judges. Hal Puthoff was a judge, Jessica Utz, a well-known statistician, Professor Jeffrey Kripal, the journalist Leslie Kane was a judge, the former CIA officer and medical doctor Kit Green was a judge, and also the Brian Weiss, who's written many books on past life therapists. So those were the 6 judges, and they're the ones who who made a decision. And I have received no feedback whatsoever in terms of what part of my essay impressed them the most. So I can only surmise what they thought or what Robert Bigelow may have thought. And I think you have to look at the essay as a whole. The point that I made, the main point that I made in my essay is that the best evidence is the combination of all the evidence. And all the evidence that I brought to bear in that essay included not only the literature on reincarnation and near-death experience and possession and Picandarian experiences and mental mediumship and physical mediumship and instrumental transcommunication. All of those things. It also included some personal stories of my own experience along the way. So I have to say that I think the essays were judged holistically rather than individually. If I had to choose any one single piece of evidence, I'd have a hard time because, the intellect, the critical mind, you can tear down any single piece of evidence, but when they accumulate and you see evidence pointing toward the afterlife from 9 different independent directions, then you begin to form what would be thought of in philosophy and in science as an inductive, logical analysis of the empirical data, all pointing in that direction. And that, I think, was the strength of my essay. And I can tell you this as well, because I did talk to the judges about this. Most of the contestants in the Bigelow competition wrote essays along the same lines. They pretty much all selected highlights from the vast literature that we've had since the Society for Psychical Research was formed in 1882. We have 140 years of journals documenting cases of mediumship and many other things purporting to provide evidence in favor of human survival. And I have to tell you, for another 30 years prior to that, the spiritualist movements in Europe, in America, and even in Latin America were providing evidence. There were great books written long before the Society for Psychical Research was founded, documenting very impressive evidence for survival. And of course, you can even find it in the ancient writings of Plato and Pliny. It's no secret that all across the world, people in every culture, every religion have held this belief. And you could say, well, it's just because humans are superstitious or prone to fantasy or wishful thinking. But you might also say that humans all across the world had access to the same body of empirical evidence that we also know about, and that influenced their thinking. Enzi Soundville says, what's your take on the legend of air from Plato's Republic? Well, just what I was alluding to a moment ago. The legend of air. Air was a soldier who died in battle. Well, he was thought dead, I should say, and his body was lying on a heap with the other corpses and after a battle. But after a length of time, he awakened and came back to life. And Plato writes about this case. It appears to be one of the very first documented cases of a near-death experience. And Plato uses it to try to draw moral lessons, which actually you get from a lot of near-death experiencers about how your experience of the afterlife is going to be conditioned by your experiences in the world. Now, Air was a soldier. He was in battle. He was killing people. I have talked to, for example, in my days as a psychotherapist, which when I lived in California, I had a client. He was a businessman, a normal average businessman, trying to hustle money, put together various entrepreneurial enterprises, outsmart the competition, find an edge wherever he could. And I have to say, from my experience and people in business, it's not unusual if you find some opportunity where you can earn a little extra money by cheating in a small way, telling some white lies or something. People do it all the time. And sometimes people do it big time. So there's a certain acceptance of unethical behavior in the business world, that a certain amount of it is considered, I think, normal. And you'll often find people who are accused of committing fraud, for example, and they'll say, why are you picking on me? Everybody does it. But what if you're such a person and now you've had a near-death experience? How are you going to return to that life where you say, yeah, everybody does it. It's okay to engage in taking advantage of your friends, your neighbors, your customers, your suppliers, and so on, and your competitors. You see, people who have had near-death experiences come back with an understanding of, I guess, what we'd have to call higher ethical values. The values of love, the values of compassion, the values of selflessness rather than selfishness. And so people often have a hard time adjusting to life back on the physical plane after they've had such an experience, not just a near-death experience, also mystical experiences in general, because you could say the near-death experience is just one kind of mystical experience. And Plato tries to draw these lessons out when he describes the story of air in the Republic. But as far as I can see, his attempt to draw ethical conclusions is very similar to my understanding of the process that people go through who have had these experiences, because many, many times it's very hard for them to adjust after they come back. The number of divorces that occur is high. And people often report it can take years to integrate the intense spiritual encounter one has in the near-death experience to live a life in accordance with what the Buddhists would call right livelihood. Here's a question from Lewis Jackson. Some say we can declare, quote, no more karma in this lifetime, and by doing so can escape the cycle of reincarnation. Do you think we have the free will or the right to opt out of the cycle of birth and rebirth? Well, I can tell you this, Lewis. It's a metaphysical question. I could not begin to answer it from the perspective of an empiricist or from anything having to do with the parapsychological research. Now, fortunately, that's not the only hat I wear. I'm also the past president of the Intuition Network, an organization, a nonprofit organization devoted to creating a world in which all people are encouraged to cultivate and apply their inner intuitive knowledge. So this is something that each person has to discover within themselves. I can tell you what I think about it, but ultimately, if you're concerned about, do you want to keep being reborn? I hear from many viewers who say, yeah, this is a horrible world. The worst thing that could ever happen to me is to be reborn here yet again. I'm out of here as fast as I can be. Now, is that a possibility? I think it is, but is it an easy thing to do? Can you just do it by snapping your fingers like that? I don't think so. I think that Well, I should refer you to this. There is a video recently released. Maybe it's the one that you're referring to when you say some people say no more karma. It's with R.J. Spina, who I mentioned earlier, and it's called Overcoming Your Karma. And he's saying, yeah, we can totally detach from our karma. We can, but you know, it's getting very hot in this room. I think somewhere in this house, the heat is on, and I'm going to start perspiring quite heavily. So I think I need to take like a 1-minute break to adjust the temperature in here. I'm going to ask you people to excuse me for 1 minute because I don't want to, the live stream is going to continue for another 45 minutes. And I'm in my studio here. Normally I would even turn on the air conditioning, but it's still winter. But hold on, let me at least turn the fan on in this room and turn the heat off for a minute, and I'll be right back. So bear with me, please. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me. And let's move on. Patrick Rooney says, is it possible we are being manipulated after physical death? It always seems the person's beliefs and emotions play a big part in what they see after death. Well, yes, people's beliefs and emotions do play a big part in the reports of near-death experiencers. But now that's different than saying we are being manipulated. But you could say there is a sense in which we are being manipulated. And in this regard, when you want to have a detailed description of the afterlife and what's really going on and who's in charge and how does it work, there are several maps available to look at. There's the extensive writings of Allan Kardec, who was a 19th century French pedagogue who named Hippolyte Rivel, but he wrote under the pen name of Allan Kardec, and he's the founder of the Spiritist movement. And he developed a methodology involving interviewing mediums, interviewing spirits through the mediums and asking them about the afterlife. And when 7 different mediums would all agree about something, he would say, well, that must be true. And so he's written, I don't know, 5 or 6 books about it. And it's the basis of the Spiritist religions, which one finds particularly active in Brazil today, but certainly in practically every other country as well. And they will talk about the idea that, yes, there are highly evolved spirits who have the capacity to actually, through their mental powers, create the environments in which the deceased will find themselves in the afterlife. So some people describe, yes, there's a city. We all live in this city. The Brazilians made a movie about it called Nosso Lar, which I think means our city. And it's a city in the afterlife, hovering somewhere above Brazil in the heavenly regions. That's one vision. So one would say, yes, these evolved beings are creating the conditions so that when people enter into the afterlife, it feels relatively familiar to them. And you find that not only in the Spiritist literature, but there's a great deal of additional literature from many, many other traditions. I'm particularly fond of a book called The Road to Immortality. It was a book written by Geraldine Cummins, who was an automatic writer in 1932, I think, and purportedly being dictated to her by the discarnate Frederick Myers, the great psychical researcher, one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. I think he died in 1902, before his masterpiece, Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, was published posthumously. And he, after his death, began initiating a series of communications through different mediums in England, in the United States, and in India. And the messages from these different mediums, from Myers, the intriguing thing is they often only made sense when they were put together, like each medium was given one piece of the message. But you had to put them together to understand the entire message. And it appears this was Myers' way of establishing his actual existence on the other side. And then he dictated, at some 30 years after his death, this book, published as The Road to Immortality, in which he describes the levels of the afterlife, the transformations that take place as you move from level to level, and the idea, yes, that there are beings who have some responsibility for creating the circumstances that individual souls experience when they are in the afterlife. So in that sense, you could call it manipulation. I don't think of it in a negative way, because from what I gather, it's all very loving, very positive, all ultimately aimed at the evolution of consciousness toward greater compassion and greater love. Here is a question from William Ritako. He says, do you believe we have access to other souls in the afterlife of other deceased loved ones to communicate with? Do we have access to other souls? Meaning, I'm not sure what he means by other souls of other deceased loved ones. Yeah, I don't know that there's any limit on it. You know, if you're a spirit medium, for example, you have access to a great number of souls in the afterlife. And to the extent that I would endorse spiritual mediumship as a legitimate phenomenon, and I think there's good reason to do that, I would say absolutely yes to that question. Rob Hooks 9 says, Frederick Myers expected that communicators from the other side were planning experiments of a complexity and difficulty which surpass our imagination. What kind of experiments do you think these are? Well, I alluded a moment ago to the cross correspondences that Myers himself appears to have initiated after he died from the other side. And I think that's actually, you know, he wrote about it in his book, Survival of Human Consciousness After Bodily Death. And he suggested that communicators, as Rob Hook 9 says, were planning these experiments of such complexity and difficulty. Now, was that what he was alluding to, or was he thinking of something else? I mean, obviously, if you're on the other side, you may not be interested in what's going on here on the earth plane. You might be much more interested in your own spiritual evolution. But you might have other interests. There was a suggestion in some of the cross correspondences, and it's something of an embarrassment to the whole field of psychical research, that there was a project going on the other side to create something of a new Messiah. And it appears to have been misguided at best. The various prophecies regarding a new Messiah never bore out. There was also a certain amount of what is the word? Maybe I could just be explicit and say one of the mediums was having an affair with one of the researchers, and they were both married to other people. And that was going on. They had a child, and that all of a sudden the messages began coming through that this child was going to be a very special child, and who would be a world savior of some sort. And the child turned out to be a very fine person, but not a world savior. So maybe there was such a project like that coming from the other side, and it simply failed. Who knows? I honestly, at this, I can't really illuminate the question much more than that, Rob. And okay, William Ritako has a second question. Gee, he has a third and a fourth, I see. He says, what are my thoughts on the link between the afterlife and UFO high strangeness encounters? This is a subject dear to my heart. And I think if you look through the listings page on New Thinking Aloud, and there's a link to the listing page you can find in the descriptions of every single video. I know many viewers don't bother to read the descriptions, but we put a lot of information there. It's worth looking at. And I often find questions from commenters who obviously haven't read the descriptions, but they are asking information that they would already know if they did read the descriptions. So there is my whole monologue about UFOs in the afterlife. And it goes on for about 15 minutes. So I'm not going to repeat the whole thing here, but you've got many examples of a kind of an overlap, which is why when I gave my acceptance speech at the Bigelow Institute Award ceremony, I concluded it by saying to the billionaires, the people like Elon Musk and the other billionaires who are interested in traveling into outer space and are building rockets for that purpose. I said, if you think the human race is ever going to join the community of species capable of interstellar travel, we have to understand hyperspace. It's the only way we can really travel through any great distances. And in order to understand hyperspace, we have to understand the relationship between hyperspace and consciousness. And that means understanding the afterlife, as I've alluded to earlier. That's the link. That's why you have people like Whitley Strieber pointing out that in his encounters with the visitors, that he found that there were deceased humans, people he knew amongst them, and why other people, and these are all in the New Thinking Aloud catalog, interviews, Robin Foy of the Skoll Group, who talked about the mediumistic sessions that they would hold with deceased entities who would come through, as well as extraterrestrials. In fact, he talks about an ET being actually physically materializing in their seance room. So the overlap is immense, and it's the kind of thing that both the UFO researchers and the parapsychologists are too embarrassed for the most part to talk about or delve into. Fortunately, there are a few of us who are beyond embarrassment about it and figure no matter how strange and weird it seems, the stranger and the weirder things are probably the most important ones to begin to look into. PB asks, question, are there any speculations about dark matter being related to afterlife matter and realities? It's an interesting one. No, I'm not aware of any serious explanations. or speculations of that sort. I think maybe you find it in the fictional writings of Philip Pullman in his books, The Amber Knife. He has a whole series of novels in which he talks about dark matter. He sometimes refers to it as dust, and suggests that it's somehow related to consciousness. Well, let me think now. I'm pretty sure if you looked into the work of Vernon Neppy and his partner, Bill Close, or William Close, I've interviewed both of them on the New Thinking Aloud channel. I do think there's even, now that you mention it, a video with Vernon talking about dark matter and dark energy that he would make that link. I do think so in terms of their own hyperdimensional model. So yeah, I guess it's fair to say there has been some speculation. Now, we're almost at the top of the hour. I want to let you know I'll be going for another half hour. And of course, if you're just logging in now and you missed the earlier portions, the archival video does go online once we finish. Paulie M asks, why would we reincarnate into abusive situations if it were real? That's actually, the deeper question is, what is the purpose of human suffering? If we are here because of a loving, benevolent deity, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? Not just pain and suffering, but needless, useless pain and suffering, and abuse to make things even worse. What could possibly be the purpose of that? And maybe the best answer I can give you, every time this question comes up, and it comes up in almost every single live stream in one way or another, and I give an answer like I'm about to give, then people comment and say, how can you say that? Human suffering is such a horrible thing. You tell that to the victims of the Holocaust. See what they say about it. Now, right, from the human perspective, this does not seem reasonable. From the human perspective, all of the abuse and suffering on this planet has led many people to the conclusion that we are living in Satan's kitchen, so to speak. This is a realm ruled by archons, ruled by evil entities who trick us into thinking that they are benevolent deities. But the truth is, we're here to be punished. And many people take that as their religion. And who am I to say otherwise? But my mentor, one of my mentors, was Arthur M. Young, the inventor of the Bell helicopter, the very first commercially licensed helicopter in 1947, the Bell Model 47. There's one of them today hanging in the Smithsonian Institute. Arthur Young became a cosmologist after he finished his great invention of the helicopter. He wrote a wonderful book called The Reflexive Universe. He engaged in deep explorations of psychic phenomena around the world, and he studied such things as astrology and alchemy. And on one occasion, he said to me, Jeffrey, what do you think the alchemists meant about the philosopher's stone? The magical stone that converts lead into gold. And of course, the Jungian alchemists, the psychological alchemists would say, we're talking about turning the lead into gold of the human soul. That's what alchemy was, is really a metaphorical language. He said, what is the philosopher's stone? And I said, I don't know. And he said to me, the philosopher's stone are the challenges that you face in life. These are the challenges that cause you to grow and to become a better person. Now, it's not always easy to accept that, especially when you're feeling that you're in the grip of like a vice crushing you and hurting you. And you try to say, this is good for me. Doesn't make sense, especially if you're destined to fail. Take, for example, the Ukrainian people. I don't have any final answers about that situation, but from what you hear in the news, and I trust the news, the situation is impossible. The Ukrainians are putting up a brilliant fight. They're holding off the Russians, but they're destined to lose at the end of the day. I hope that's not true, but that's what it appears to be. And the point I want to make by bringing this up isn't a political point at all. It's the same point you find if you're reading Shakespearean tragedies, which are considered, for example, some of the greatest literature that's ever been written. It could be King Lear or Hamlet or Macbeth. In each case, you have a hero who is destined to fail. But in the process of failing, the hero discovers within himself or within herself something noble, something wise, something more enlightened. Now, the hero may die, but you see the learning, what was gained even in the process of encountering that tragic circumstance. That we can take with us into the afterlife. We may not be able to take our material possessions, but the life lessons that we learn, in particular, the lesson of being a more compassionate, loving person, which at the end of the day is what I think it's all about, that we get to take with us. And that's why I think sometimes people get incarnated into terribly abusive situations. And that's why there is so much suffering. It's not for nothing. It's about creating a challenge that we have to rise up to meet. Now, a lot of people are going to say that's airy-fairy, namby-pamby, wishful thinking. How dare you say that to the people who are being slaughtered right now in the Ukraine? But they are rising to the challenge, as far as I can tell. Okay, I'll move on. Monica Mush says, Putin's attack on Ukraine, well, there we go, puts the world into a state of crisis. Is it true that the dreamer creates a reality by dreaming, and our world is dreamt into existence by the collective of all dreamers? Well, you know, Monica, I've done several interviews with Paul Levy on exactly that topic, that ultimately he would say, and many other people, Bernardo Kastrup would say, what is the collective unconscious? The collective unconscious is the world all around us. That is it. But it's also the world within us as well. And ultimately, if we are to take what the great mystics pretty much all say and take it at face value that we're one with the whole thing. We're one with what Stan Groff, a wonderful psychiatrist, called the cosmic game. So, yeah, it seems like a terrible, tragic thing. And you could say it's a projection of our fears. When we are fearful and project our fears onto the world responds by actualizing those fears and confronting us with our own fears. Now we have to deal with that. So the idea that life is but a dream, I think is one that needs to be taken quite seriously. It's a deep idea. It's not just an idea for poets. It's an idea that has to do with the relationship between the realm of consciousness and the realm of the senses, the realm of the phenomena that we believe are external to ourselves. But actually, I don't think the external world really is external. I think that it's all of a piece. It's all one, internal, external. I'm in the middle of it, and it's in the middle of me. And so there is a sense in which we're responsible for the whole package. Now, individually, it's hard to take responsibility. What do I, sitting here in Albuquerque, have to do with the war in Ukraine? It would be very arrogant and egotistical to say, yeah, I brought that on. But let me be specific about it. There is a sense in which we are all aspects of the one consciousness. If I think of it in terms of my ego consciousness, no, of course, my ego consciousness may be, something associated with what goes on inside of my skin. My ego consciousness, it was not responsible for creating these larger events. But I've referred earlier to the one mind that sees through the eyes of all living creatures. A term I picked up from my friend Bernardo Kastrup, who got it from Schopenhauer. At that level, yeah, there's some responsibility for the whole theater of consciousness, not just on this planet even, but throughout the known physical universe, throughout the trillions of planets that must be out there. There's a sense of it's all a collective dream. And collective meaning a dream, well, of the one consciousness. Sometimes the Hindus would say Vishnu is asleep and dreaming the world, or in the Norse traditions, it would be Wotan who is asleep, and in his dream, these things are happening. Ultimately, and I can tell you this, the metaphysical philosophers debate this question of, are you like a drop in the ocean, or are you more like a leaf on the tree that will never be the whole tree? So, philosophers can debate these things. Ultimately, for you, Monica, or Michelle, who was asking, who is the dreamer? Ultimately, these are questions you have to look inside yourself to find the answers. If you hear me suggesting an answer, well, take it or leave it as you will. It's good, it's useful. This kind of metaphysical talk is only useful if it prompts you to open up more to your own intuitions about these things. Okay, let us go on. Miss Bliss, 711, asks, is there a possibility that a person in his past life was an extraterrestrial? Well, of course, why not? And not only a possibility, but I remember once I was attending one of these New Age conferences, like the Kohotech conference in San Francisco, and somebody was on stage and he said, raise your hand if you believe you've come here from another planet. And I think about a third of the people in the room, there were 1,000 people, they all raised their hands. These are people who have had intuitions that they've had past lives on other planets. And why not? If you can go from lifetime to lifetime in this planet, so why not also experience from other planets? And so there is a sense, if this is true, that we're all extraterrestrials just inhabiting these spacesuits, as R.J. Spina once called them, these human bodies. We're not exactly human. We're just, temporarily inhabiting these bodies. There are a lot of problems philosophically with that. That's sort of the ghost in the machine viewpoint of philosophical dualism. It runs into all kinds of logical problems. The ultimately only way to resolve the philosophical problems of dualism or materialism, which are both problematic, is to go, as Bernardo Kastrup does, to idealism. And I make a point of this in the essay, incidentally. And idealism takes you back to the idea of there's one mind behind all of it. And I know this, some people find this a very offensive idea for a wide variety of reasons, but I can't help but think it's the most logically compelling idea. So yeah, it has to do with levels of reality, because at one level, we are very, very human. My wife at one time said, we are our bodies. That's who we are. That's it. And at one level, that is absolutely true. At other levels, let's say there are 7 different levels, and at each level, the truths of one level become the falsehoods. So it's like there are polarities. At the next level, it's false. At the next level, it's true again. At the next level, it's false and true and false and true, until you reach a kind of, it's all one. And then you go into, well, it's all nothing. JJ D. Nanocan says, you explain how different faith traditions have established different afterlife experiences. Shouldn't they all be the same? Well, yes and no. First of all, we only get reports from people who, if you had a near-death experience, you come back to report on it, you're putting it into the words and the language and the cultural idioms into which you were born. So simply taking these experiences, which almost everyone says it's ineffable, it's beyond words, there's nothing I can say that will really convey to you the ineffable, magical, wondrous quality of, for example, I not only experienced love greater than any love I've ever known on earth, even as a parent, I was that love. Now, you can try and say that in words, and the words are very distinctly culturally defined. That's what language is, after all. But there's yet a reality underneath the words. And to what extent our cultural expectations actually shape the afterlife, I can't say for sure, but it does appear that our expectations do have an influence, that you see the realm of the living and the realm of the departed interpenetrate each other. They influence each other. So it's not as if they're completely independent. I don't think so. I think they're very dependent upon each other on the one hand. On the other hand, a great deal of what people experience is beyond all words. So cultural expectations can only go so far. NM says, it's a pleasure to be with you. Your work is a profound light to the world. Thank you. Do you have thoughts about what the essential organ of our awareness might be? What is the perceiver that transcends life? Well, for a long time, parapsychologists were trying to find the organ of psychic perception. Could it be the pineal gland? What is this third eye all about? Maybe it is the pineal or the pituitary gland, or could it be the synapses? Does it have anything to do with quantum mechanics and the microtubules inside the neurons of the brain? So far, there's never been any organ identified. And I think the reason that is that the mind doesn't exist in the brain. Rather, the brain exists in the mind. Consciousness itself is the organ. But when we try to talk about what is consciousness, then we get into the distinction, of course, between your individual consciousness and this larger consciousness that I keep referring to as the one mind that sees through the eyes of all sentient beings. There's also the distinction between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And so what are we talking about when we refer to the unconscious consciousness? All of these things have been debated for decades and decades by philosophers and psychologists, but I keep coming back to it. I've been doing this work, interviewing, talking about these things for half a century, and the most important insight that I come to over and over and over again is that we are all one. It's all of a piece. All this feeling that we have of separate, and I'm better than you, and I'm different than you. It's true at one level, for sure. I don't want to dismiss it and say there's nothing to it, but it's not the only perspective. It's a very limited perspective on what's really going on. And I just want to remind you, we've got less than 15 minutes before this live stream ends. I will collect your questions and see about them again. I will also tell you our next live stream 3 weeks from today will be on March 20th. And our guest then is going to be Marla Fries, who is a medium, a psychic herself, and the author of American Psychic. Marla has been a guest on New Thinking Aloud in the past a couple of times, and she'll be our next live stream guest in 3 weeks. Also, I want to say right now before I forget, we have a wonderful weekly newsletter. If you're not a subscriber, you can subscribe for free. There's no charge by logging into the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website, which is newthinkingaloud.org, rather than if you go newthinkingaloud.com, takes you to the YouTube channel. Newthinkingaloud.org will take you to our foundation website where you can sign up for the newsletter. We have a few items for sale, like these lapel pins. We also have in the news opportunities you can donate. You can help keep us going. There are expenses to operate and put 4 videos a week or more up online. So your donations are appreciated. And in the newsletter, if you subscribe, we recommend books. There's a featured book every week. We often feature artwork and poetry, often submitted by viewers such as yourself, and you have advance access to the videos for the upcoming week. Okay. Peter Deutsch asks, do you have a comment on the recent experimental accident which recorded the brainwaves of a dying person and it indicated memories were activated upon death? Well, I seem to recall there was a report recently like that in the scientific literature, and it reminded me of the fact that when I interviewed Stuart Hameroff, the consciousness theorist, he pointed out to me that it was known, and this was several years ago, at the moment of death, very often, he works with, because he's an anesthesiologist, with a device that it has a proprietary way of measuring the degree of consciousness of a patient under anesthesia. So he doesn't know exactly what was being measured, but he did observe, and it's been reported in the literature that at the moment of death, there is a sharp spike in, you could say, conscious lucidity that takes place. You also get this in reports of what is called terminal lucidity, and I've experienced this with my own mother, who had Alzheimer's and died, and with other people who they could be in really bad shape, like unable to sit up, unable to talk, And shortly before their death, they can sit up, they can become lucid, they can have a lengthy, highly intelligent conversation with you, and then they're gone. And what that suggests is, of course, that consciousness is independent of the brain. And the funny thing is that the antagonists to human survival used to say, people like Bertrand Russell would say, well, we know that if the brain is damaged, you lose memory. Therefore, it's hardly conceivable that when the brain dies completely, consciousness would live on. But actually, now we have a large body of evidence saying that when the brain shuts down, consciousness can increase. And that includes the evidence from terminal lucidity. It includes some of this evidence that we're just referring to, an increase in some brain activity right before death. It includes also research on psychedelics, where people report incredibly meaningful, rich imagery in the psychedelic experience, far more vivid than normal consciousness. And yet the EEG studies show that large parts of the brain are shutting down, allowing that to happen. It's as if the brain is the filter that keeps us from being aware of this awesome cosmic consciousness that is our natural birthright. David Vidal says, you've dealt with regretful people in the prison system. During some horrible crimes, are they assisted at times? An evil kind of luck, are they agreeing to a different life or afterlife? That is an interesting question. You know, there are many accounts that would suggest as much, that there are dark forces in the afterlife, what sometimes referred to as the lower astral plane, demonic entities in the traditional religious traditions who like to possess people and seduce them into giving up their soul, so to speak. I think it's very rare, but I can't rule it out. And if you listen to the accounts of some of these individuals, there's every reason to think that there might be some overlap between various forms of mental illness and a sort of persecution by these negative entities. It's been written about extensively by people such as the psychologist Wilson Van Dusen, who was chief psychologist at Napa State Mental Hospital. He was also a Swedenborgian. You find he relied on the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th century mystic, to interpret the experiences he encountered at Napa State Mental Hospital working with people who were severely psychotic. And of course, you have many examples of the criminally insane who say, I heard voices telling me to do such and such. And I've heard of other examples that are chilling. And so one might ask, well, you know, if we live in a world with a loving God, why are these horrible, chilling things happening? Why would God unleash demons on us in this world? And of course, I think I've answered that earlier, so I'm not going to repeat myself. We have just 5 minutes left. Let's continue. John Hernandez says, what possible links exist between the notions of the afterlife and rebirth and the symbolism surrounding alchemy and Hermeticism, or from cultures such as ancient Egypt? Well, when you start getting into the realm of symbolism, it's very complex, and each culture has their own preferred sets of symbols and their own myths. And of course, Egypt is a very good place to look, because it seems as if a lot of Western esoteric thought originated in Egypt. just as a lot of Eastern esoteric thought originated in India. The Egyptians have their Book of the Dead, or as they actually translated, the Book of Coming Forth into the Light. So I'm sure that there are many, many links, and I've alluded to alchemy, I've alluded to Hermeticism. In Hermeticism, you have the classic phrase from the Emerald Tablet, as above, so below, meaning that, in the afterlife, or the astral plane, as it's sometimes referred to, it's not all that different from life here in the physical plane. And there are many accounts that would suggest just that in some of the early stages of the afterlife, there are houses, there are villages, there are communities, there are institutions, there might even be governments. People have activities and friendships, they work in jobs and so on the other side, just like they do here. So there's a lot to be gleaned from that literature. A certain amount of it may well be psychological projection. That's why I've proposed that we launch a new line of research with psychonauts to explore the afterlife. Okay, I think time for one last question, and it'll have to be a quick one from Mark J., who says, I believe that human consciousness, directed with intention, could reverse climate change. Would you agree? Well, yeah, I would say it's a possibility, but and it might be the case, such as people were asking. I did see some questions about my work with Ted Owens. What would it take? How much intention is required? Could it be the case that one very powerful mystic could do it themselves? A great mystic magician. I have an interview that has yet to be released, but R.J. Spina talks about a figure known as Maha Avatar Babaji, a spiritual being described in the autobiography of a yoga, who has been alive for thousands of years. And maybe if he wanted to, through his intention alone, he could end the problems of climate change, warfare, everything. He could take care of it. Or, some other very high deity. One might say, well, one of the Elohim, or maybe Vishnu could do it. Or maybe if everybody, if a billion, maybe just 1 billion, maybe even if 10 very powerful humans got together, it could be done, or 100 or 1,000. I don't know. And I think from the perspective of Stanislav Grof's writings on the cosmic game, is if we could do it, would we? Or would that be a way of removing an important lesson? Maybe the problem of climate change needs to be solved by right action, not by some powerful magician exercising conscious intention. It brings up the notion that is sometimes referred to as a spiritual bypass. That is, we go up to the spiritual realm and bypass all the problems that we're here in the physical plane to learn, to master. That there's a reason we're here on the physical plane. There's a reason we're confronted with all of these problems. Maybe it is to learn how to master them through the power of conscious intention. Maybe it's also, when it comes to climate change, which seems to be largely man-made, that the lesson is that we have to change our behavior en masse. Okay, our time is up. It's been a great pleasure to be with you. We will continue holding these live stream events, probably every 3 weeks, but maybe we'll even start to do them more frequently. I certainly love them. I have lots of positive feedback from viewers. And so I'll say goodbye for now.